In the ruins of Berlin, 15-year-old Klaus Becker clutched a weapon, waiting for the monsters he was taught to fear. Prepared to perish, he was stunned when an American soldier called him a boy and offered water instead of a shell. Seeing Japanese prisoners of war nearby treated with dignity, Klaus felt years of malignant lies shatter in an instant. On the 12th of May, 1945, the world was ending in the Kreuzberg district. Klaus Becker crouched within the skeletal remains of a tenement building, the air thick with the smell of pulverized limestone and the metallic tang of old blood. The Panzerfaust anti-tank launcher felt like a leaden weight across his gaunt shoulders, its cold steel a stark contrast to his trembling, malnourished hands. His fingers, blackened with soot, gripped the firing mechanism with a strength born of pure adrenaline. For 3 days, his only sustenance had been fear and the bitter dust of pulverized brick. He could feel, his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. The oversized uniform draped over his small frame made him look like a child playing dress-up, but the Volkssturm armband signaled a much darker reality. It was a strip of cloth that marked him as a combatant, a target, and a sacrifice. As the rhythmic grinding of American tank treads echoed through the alleyways, Klaus remembered the warnings of his vanished superior squadron leader, a man who had spoken of duty while packing his own bags to flee. He had been told the Americans were subhuman barbarians who would inflict agonizing ends upon captives, leaving him with only the choice of victory or taking his own life. The propaganda had been a constant hum in his ears since he was 6 years old, a melody of hatred that now reached its crescendo. When the massive Sherman tank finally halted at the end of the street, its engine idling with a low predatory growl, Klaus felt the world shrink. The turret traversed toward his hiding spot with mechanical indifference. He squeezed his eyes shut, expecting his final moment, his mind flashing through fragmented memories of a childhood before the sirens became the only music he knew. Instead of a shell, he heard a firm voice calling him boy in broken German, commanding him to lower his weapon. The word boy, Junge, pierced through his terror. It was not a word used for a soldier of the Reich. Emerging with his hands raised, he found himself towered over by men who looked like giants in their combat gear. A black soldier, whom propaganda had described as a savage, stepped forward. Klaus flinched, bracing for a blow, but it never came. The soldier offered not a blade, but a canteen of cool water. As Klaus drank, the liquid soothing his parched throat, he looked toward the rear where other Japanese prisoners of war were being held. These Japanese prisoners of war sat on the ground, sharing space with German captives who were being fed rather than executed. The sight was a cognitive explosion. These were the men he had been told would torture him, yet they were treating the Japanese prisoners of war and his own countrymen with a casual, almost bored professionalism. If this shift in perspective, from a boy ready to fight to a child realizing he was saved, speaks to you, please subscribe to help us keep these powerful stories alive. To understand why Klaus was standing in those ruins, we must look at the People's Storm. The systematic use of children was the final, desperate gamble of a regime that had conscripted roughly 6 million males between the ages of 16 and 60. By the time 1945 arrived, the German war machine was a hollow shell. In practice, boys as young as 12 were swept up from their schools, given a few days of training on how to aim a rocket at a tank, and told that passing away for the leader was the ultimate honor. They were issued weapons that were often more dangerous to the user than the target. Many of these youths fought with a terrifying, self-destructive intensity. They were not fighting for a strategic objective. They were fighting because they genuinely believed that capture meant a fate worse than perishing. They believed the stories of trophy hunting and systematic slaughter promised by their officers. This created a nightmare for the advancing Allied forces. American soldiers, many of whom had sons the same age at home, faced an impossible moral dilemma as they moved through the city. They were forced to engage hostile adolescents who were often more fanatical than the seasoned veterans of the regular army. This led to approximately 40,000 to 60,000 young lives lost in the final months of the conflict. Yet, the records are filled with instances of American soldiers risking their own safety to shout for surrender, firing over the heads of children or using loudspeakers to convince them to quit before. The tanks were forced to return fire. Sergeant Robert Mitchell's trauma reflects the impossible choice of the GIs. He carried the memory of ending the lives of 2 teenagers near Nuremberg for 50 years, struggling with the fact that while his actions were militarily necessary, he had still harmed children. He recalled the moment he entered the building and saw the snipers, 2 boys who couldn't have been older than 14 lying beside their rifles. The guilt was a heavy shadow that never lifted. This burden was the hidden cost of the war, as American soldiers found themselves caught between survival and their own moral revulsion at the regime's use of human shields. How do you think a soldier balances the duty to protect his men with the instinct to protect a child? Let us know in the comments below. Following the capture, the narrative of the savage enemy began to crumble in the prisoner of war camps. As the front lines shifted, massive numbers of captives were funneled into holding centers. Klaus was moved to a facility near Mannheim. The journey was a revelation. He saw convoys of Allied supplies, food, medicine, and equipment that dwarfed anything the German army had possessed for years. He also saw the diversity of the Allied forces. In the camps, he encountered Japanese prisoners of war who had been serving in various capacities or captured in different theaters. The children were separated from radicalized elements to prevent the older, unyielding officers from continuing the indoctrination. In these camps, Klaus's expectations of atrocities were replaced by the reality of regular meals and professional treatment. He watched as Japanese prisoners of war and German youths alike were processed with a level of organization that prioritized survival over revenge. The Americans were not the monsters of the newsreels. They were tired men who wanted to go home, but who nonetheless shared their rations and ensured the wounded were treated. The daily routine in the camp was designed to break the psychological grip of the past decade. For many, the true denazification did not come from a lecture or a film, but from the realization that the people they were told to fear were the ones ensuring they stayed alive. Klaus learned English from a guard whose own parents had emigrated from Europe. They spoke about movies, about families, and about a future that didn't involve trenches. When Klaus finally returned to his mother in November 1945, he carried with him the realization that the regime had lied about everything, including the character of their enemies. The young soldier who had been prepared to cease existing for a lie now stood amidst the rubble of Berlin with a future he never expected to see. The city was a graveyard of brick, but for the first time, the sirens were silent. The contrast was absolute. The gray, broken ruins of his home against the bright, colorful wrappers of American chocolate. In his pocket, he held a small piece of paper with the address of the guard who had shown him kindness, a bridge to a world he had been told was his mortal enemy. An American soldier approached him one last time near the processing center, handing him a bar of chocolate and saying, "You get to be kids again." The simplicity of the statement was devastating. Klaus began to weep, not from the hunger of the past weeks or the pain of the ruins, but from the overwhelming sweetness of a mercy he was told did not exist. He had nearly perished fighting for evil, yet the people who defeated that evil gave him back his life. He looked at the Japanese prisoners of war being loaded onto trucks for their own repatriation and realized that the world was far larger and more complex than the narrow, hateful lens he had been forced to look through. Consider the depth of the hunger Klaus felt. In Berlin, by early 1945, the official daily ration for a teenager was barely enough to sustain life. They were existing on ersatz products, substitutes that offered no nutritional value. Coffee was made from roasted acorns, bread was cut with sawdust. To see a Japanese prisoner of war eating a standard American field ration which contained real fats, real sugars, and actual proteins was a shock that hit the senses before the intellect. This was a war won not just with bullets, but with calories. The psychological warfare practiced by the Reich had convinced Klaus that American forces would end the existence of any prisoner of color or use them for experimentation. When he saw Japanese prisoners of war being treated as legitimate combatants entitled to the protections of the Geneva Convention, the internal contradictions of the Nazi worldview began to unravel. The propaganda machine had claimed that the Americans were intolerant. Yet Klaus saw an army that, while flawed, was functioning as a multicultural machine that showed more mercy to its enemies than the Reich showed to its own people's storm. This mercy was also reflected in the white flag incidents. In the final weeks, many German officers threatened to eliminate any subordinate who attempted to surrender. Klaus had seen a neighbor, an old man in the Volkssturm, pass away at the hands of his own commander for merely suggesting they throw away their rifles. The Americans, recognizing this, began to use innovative tactics. They would park a tank at the end of a street and simply wait, giving the children time to decide their own fate. They gave them the agency that their own government had stolen. In the prisoner of war camps like Mannheim, the Japanese prisoners of war often became the mediators. Having been captured in different theaters of war, they had already processed the reality of their situation. They saw the German boys as victims of a similar machine. The Americans encouraged this interaction, using the shared status of prisoner to break down nationalistic fervor. Klaus remembered a Japanese prisoner of war who taught him how to stitch a torn uniform. It was a simple domestic act of kindness that stood in opposition to the lethal rhetoric he had heard for a decade. The re-education programs also included mandatory viewings of the concentration camp footage. For many of the boys, the initial reaction was denial. They had been told the Americans were faking the images. It was only when they were taken on compulsory tours of nearby sites that the truth became undeniable. Klaus described the sensation as if his entire soul had been destroyed. He realized that the glorious defense he was part of was actually the final line of defense for a system built on mass loss of life. The American guards did not inflict punishment during these revelations. They simply stood by and allowed the weight of the truth to do its work. This transition from being a tool of the state to a human being with a conscience was painful. Many boys ceased to survive psychologically, retreating into a state of catatonic shock. But for those like Klaus, the mercy of the Americans provided a safety net. The chocolate, the clean blankets, and the English books were the tools used to rebuild a shattered psyche. By the time they were released, they were no longer little soldiers. They were young men who understood the value of peace. The Japanese prisoners of war in these camps were eventually repatriated, often carrying with them the same English books and American supplies that the Germans received. This global dispersion of humanitarian standards helped shape the post-war world. It was a victory of the spirit over the sword. Klaus Becker's return to Berlin was a somber journey, passing through cities that were nothing but piles of rubble, yet he traveled with a sense of hope. He knew that the monsters were actually his liberators. The legacy of the Volkssturm is a dark chapter in history, a warning of what happens when a state chooses to sacrifice its own children rather than admit defeat. But the story of their capture and treatment is a reminder of the power of mercy. It shows that even in the most destructive conflicts, we have the choice to treat our enemies with dignity. By choosing chocolate over retribution and water over violence, the American forces ensured that the boys of 1945 would become the men who built a better world. Imagine the sensory reality of the Mannheim camp as Klaus navigated those first few weeks of 1945. The facility was a sprawling landscape of barbed wire and wood and tar paper barracks, but to Klaus, it looked like a paradise of stability. Each morning, he was awakened not by the whistle of a falling shell, but by the orderly sound of a whistle for roll call. He stood in lines alongside Japanese prisoners of war, men whose faces told stories of long journeys from the Pacific and across the Asian continent. Though they shared no common language, the shared experience of survival created a silent brotherhood. Klaus observed that the American guards treated the Japanese prisoners of war with a standardized, if distant, fairness. This was a direct contradiction to the racial hierarchy Klaus had been forced to study. In his old school books, the world was a pyramid with his own people at the top and everyone else as servants or threats. Here, the pyramid had been leveled. Everyone was simply a captive in need of a meal. The logistics of providing for these thousands of souls were staggering. American supply trucks known as deuce and a halfs rumbled through the camp gates 24 hours a day. They brought in massive crates of 10-in-1 rations, which contained everything from powdered milk to canned pineapple. Klaus watched as Japanese prisoners of war assisted American quartermasters in unloading these supplies. It was a chore of cooperation. One afternoon, a Japanese prisoner of war handed Klaus a small tin of fruit he had scavenged from a damaged crate. The sweetness was so intense it made Klaus's teeth ache, but the kindness behind the act was even more profound. These were men who were supposed to be his enemies, or at best distant allies, in a violent cause, yet here they were, acting as human beings in a world that had tried to strip them of that title. In the barracks at night, the air was filled with a low murmur of voices. German soldiers spoke of their families in the East, wondering if they were still alive after the Soviet advance. The Japanese prisoners of war in the neighboring wing spoke in hushed tones about their homes in Osaka or Tokyo, cities that Klaus now understood were also burning under Allied bombers. The realization hit him that loss of life was a universal currency in this conflict. No one was truly winning when the cost was the passing away of so many innocent people. This was the beginning of his moral reckoning. He started to feel a profound sense of shame for the uniform he had worn with such misguided pride. The re-education sessions intensified as the summer of 1945 peaked. The Americans set up a temporary cinema in a large tent. Klaus sat on a hard wooden bench, his shoulder touching a Japanese prisoner of war, as the projector whirred to life. They were shown footage from the liberation of Buchenwald and Dachau. The silence in the tent was absolute, broken only by the occasional sob. Klaus saw the evidence of mass extermination, the piles of bodies that looked like firewood, and the hollow eyes of the survivors. He wanted to look away, to scream that it was all a lie, but the sheer volume of evidence was undeniable. He looked at the Japanese prisoner of war beside him and saw a similar expression of horror. Even those who had fought on the other side of the globe were shaken by the depths of the cruelty displayed on the screen. When the lights came up, the American chaplain stood at the front of the tent. He didn't shout. He didn't inflict anger on the boys. He simply said, "This is what happens when you follow a leader who hates. This is what you were defending." Klaus walked back to his barracks in a daze. He realized that the glory he had been promised was a mask for a machine of destruction. He spent the next 3 days in silence, unable to even look at the guards. He felt that he was complicit in a harmful crime. It was Sergeant Mitchell who eventually broke through his shell. The sergeant found Klaus sitting behind the kitchen staring into space. He didn't give him a lecture. He simply sat down, pulled a photograph of his own son out of his wallet, and showed it to Klaus. "The war's finished, Klaus," he said. "The hate has to finish too." This individual act of compassion was the bridge Klaus needed to return to the human race. He began to volunteer for every work detail, eager to do something constructive after months of destructive activity. He worked in the camp infirmary, helping the American doctors treat both German and Japanese prisoners of war. He learned that the anatomy of a human being is the same regardless of their nationality. He saw that the Japanese prisoners of war felt the same pain, bled the same red blood, and shared the same fear of ceasing to survive. The doctors taught him the basics of hygiene and first aid, skills he would carry back to the ruins of Berlin. The winter of 1945 brought a new kind of hardship. The Rhine River Valley was plunged into a deep freeze. Coal was scarce, and the camp barracks were drafty. But the Americans didn't leave them to freeze. They brought in surplus wool coats and heavy blankets. Klaus noticed that even the Japanese prisoners of war were issued heavy M1943 field jackets. The sight of an Axis soldier in American winter gear was a visual metaphor for the end of the old world. The boundaries that had once seemed so lethal and absolute were dissolving in the face of a shared humanitarian crisis. When the orders for his repatriation finally came in November, Klaus felt a strange mix of relief and anxiety. He was going back to a city that was a graveyard of dreams. He said goodbye to the Japanese prisoners of war he had befriended, exchanging small tokens, a button, a hand-carved wooden bird, a piece of string. These were the only riches they had. He realized that these men would likely spend years more in custody or transit before they saw their own homes, yet they wished him luck with genuine smiles. Their survival was now a shared victory. The journey back to Berlin was a slow crawl through a shattered landscape. Klaus sat in the back of an open truck, huddled under his American blanket. He passed through towns like Kassel and Magdeburg, which were nothing more than canyons of rubble. He saw the displaced persons camps filled with millions of people from across Europe who had no homes to go to. It was a world of unprecedented suffering, yet everywhere he saw the American stars and stripes. Flags, there was food being distributed and roads being cleared. The monsters were busy rebuilding the continent they had been forced to conquer. When he reached his mother's basement apartment in Kreuzberg, the reunion was almost silent. His mother looked at him as if he were a ghost. She had spent months believing he had perished in the final defense. She touched the fabric of his American coat and the sturdy leather of his boots, weeping because her son was not just home, but healthy. Klaus opened his pack and revealed the treasures he had saved: 3 bars of chocolate, a tin of coffee, and a small bag of sugar. To his mother, these were worth more than gold. They were proof that a world of sweetness and energy still existed. Klaus Becker's transition back to civilian life was difficult, as it was for all the Volkssturm boys. They were a generation that had been robbed of their innocence and then forced to face the harmful nature of their own beliefs. But Klaus had a head start. He had the memory of the canteen and the chocolate. He became a fixture in his community, a man who always sought the middle ground and who never tolerated the rhetoric of hate. He watched as the Marshall Plan poured billions into the reconstruction of Germany, a further act of state-level mercy that mirrored the individual mercy he had received. The Japanese prisoners of war, who eventually returned to their own islands, carried similar seeds of change. The global impact of American humanitarian policy in 1945 cannot be overstated. It was the moment that the United States decided to lead through prosperity and law, rather than just violence and occupation. Klaus Becker lived to see the Berlin Wall fall, witnessing the final end of the division that the war had created. He always maintained that the wall didn't fall because of weapons, but because people finally chose to stop believing in lies. In his final years, Klaus remained a constant presence at the neighborhood community center, dedicating his time to teaching English to a new generation of displaced people. He often held up the weathered books provided by his American captors in 1945, explaining that communication is the ultimate barrier against conflict. By ensuring his students could speak to one another, he believed he was preventing them from ever becoming the nameless enemies he had once been taught to fear. He eventually ceased to exist with a heart at rest, firm in the knowledge that his life had honored the compassion he first encountered in the wreckage of Kreuzberg. To him, a simple chocolate bar and a shared canteen were more valuable than any medal of war. The history of 1945 serves as a vital lesson. The true measure of a society is found in its treatment of the vulnerable. Choosing to protect the youth of the Volkssturm and offering dignity to Japanese prisoners of war represented a triumph of the soul over a toxic military machine. It demonstrated that even after a devastating global struggle, humanity can choose the path of the architect over that of the executioner. Klaus Becker stood as a testament to that transformative choice, leaving behind a legacy of peace that continues to shape our world. This legacy was visible in the way Klaus interacted with the local youth, often showing them how to repair old electronics, just as he had been taught in the Mannheim camp. He explained that fixing what is broken was a duty every survivor owed to the future. He spoke of the Japanese prisoners of war who had worked beside him, noting that their shared labor in the mud of the camp was the foundation of the prosperity they all eventually enjoyed. For Klaus, the economic miracle of the post-war years was a secondary achievement. The primary miracle was the fact that former combatants could sit together as friends. Klaus's story reminds us that indoctrination is a malignant force, but it is not permanent. It can be washed away by a single drink of water or a bar of chocolate given without the expectation of anything in return. He proved that no one is beyond the reach of mercy, and that a 15-year-old boy sent to perish for a lie could grow into a man who lived for the truth. His journey from the shadow of destruction to a life of service remains a guiding light for anyone facing the moral crossroads of history. If this account of humanity amidst the ruins of war moved you, please consider hitting the like button to help us share these forgotten histories. For more deep dives into the moral crossroads of the past, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. We will see you in the next chapter of history.